We are live.
Right. Hello, and welcome to the Rego Consulting Google Hangout, where today we'll be discussing PPM upgrades. My name is Steve Winchester, Vice President of Marketing with Rego Consulting. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for taking the time to join us today. As you can see from the pictures, we have a nice and illustrious panel of people joining us today, all who have a significant amount of experience with PPM and all who have some pretty strong opinions about things as well. So it will be a fun and enjoyable conversation today. Let's introduce you to everybody that's with us today. So first, Steve Sini, would you raise your hand? So Steve Sini is our Vice President of Project Delivery. He has over 25 years of industry experience, and most recently, he helped Optum Healthcare in their initial launch of CAPPM for over 30,000 users. Ramesh Rathnam, Principal Architect, will you raise your hand? There's Ramesh. Ramesh is has one of the most diverse backgrounds of anybody I've met at Rego Consulting so far. He's lived in Mumbai, London, Toronto, Ottawa, and New York City. He speaks English, French, Tamil, Hindi, and he's also semi-fluent in German and Russian. John Holdridge, would you mind raising your hand? John's our solutions architect and senior functional consultant. He has 15 years of experience in the industry, and he's really looking forward to welcoming his 9th grandchild into the world soon. And then we have Brian Wenstall. Brian is our solutions architect, and he's also one of the original founders, of Rego Consulting. He's proud to say that over the last 30 years, he's only missed one homecoming football game for his alma mater. One quick housekeeping thing before we start. We would like to answer questions during this hangout. We're going to do it by email. So if you have a question, if you could email it to camille.pack@regoconsulting.com, and we will place that up on the screen shortly. camille.pack@regoconsulting.com. We will do our best to answer your email questions. If we're unable to answer your question during the hangout, we'll certainly get back to you shortly after the hangout with an answer to your email. With that, let's get started. We know that upgrading CAPPM software, in fact, upgrading almost any kind of software in today's world can feel a little bit daunting, overwhelming, and bring some degree of uncertainty to it. So Steve Sini, let's start with you. In your opinion and with your experience, what do you think are the key things people can do to make an upgrade feel less daunting?
Okay, so for starters, welcome everybody. There's two major types of upgrades when you talk about CAPPM. There's on-demand or SaaS and on-premise, and we're going to talk about both. So now we have different specialists in the group here who have different specialties. Ramesh works to a large extent on-premise, and John works to a large extent on-demand. So as you hear us go back and forth, we're consciously going to try to cover both topics, and we are continually doing on-demand and on-premise upgrades. If I were to step back and think about what's the most important thing to think about when you're doing an upgrade, I would start out by saying, consider why are you doing the upgrade? Right. So there's a couple of significant reasons that we see. One is because you've got a compliance issue. Perhaps you're rolling out IE11, and your firm is rolling out IE11. All your users are going to be IE11, and you need to be compliant with that. Or there's a security feature that you need to deploy. Okay. So that is one reason is basic compliance with your hardware stack across your organization or your middleware stack across your organization. That can apply to both on-premise and on-demand. All right. Another obvious one is new features. Right? Is there some compelling new feature that you need to move to? Do you really want to go to Jaspersoft reporting? Okay. Are you really looking for some of the new financials that were rolled out in 13? So make sure that you're considering what's driving your upgrade going in. Some companies just have policies, and we're seeing more and more where companies just say, look, you must maintain supportability, and you must maintain your applications to a reasonable level. Really, because their policies are driven by a goal that it's more secure, okay, more state of the art. Once you've done that, sit back. Whether you're doing on-premise or on-demand, take a look at the documentation, the release notes, and the forums, right? Consider that going to the latest version has some great advantages. You get some more features, and you may have some, it may alleviate some compliance problems. However, when you go to the newest version, right, what you also may run into is you're now on the bleeding edge. So just be conscious of the fact that do you want to go to the latest version, or do you want to go to a version that's one behind, based on what do you really need? What's your reason for doing the upgrade? And are you willing to take any risks of any releases that are hot off the press? And the third thing, right, that I would put is plan. Plan it from a functional perspective, right? And that's what we've got Brian here, because he's he's one of the founders of Rego. He's been helping me with upgrades from the beginning, right? Is it functional, right? How are we going to test, right? Who's going to test? When are they going to test? Are the test people bought into the fact they're going to test, right? Or technical. And even if you're on demand, there's still technical aspects. There may be reports that have to be rewritten, portlets that have to be rewritten, right? You have to make sure that, if you're going to a newer version, it also may mean that CA is going to move to a new data center, and you have to take those things into consideration. So the things that I would say is, why are you doing the upgrade? Okay. Review your release notes and look to see, hey, the upgrade that I'm going to, does it satisfy why I'm doing it, and then to plan, right? And consider the bleeding edge talk, right? There's no sense in going to a riskier upgrade if you don't need that for your, for the reason for doing it. So, go for it. Thanks, Steve. Perfect.
Thank you. So it looks like you mentioned both on-premise and on-demand. So Ramesh, let's turn a question over to you. Are there any special considerations you need to take into account on-demand versus on-premise?
On-premise, since the customer themselves have to be responsible for the infrastructure, the maintenance of it, provisioning of it, which means when they go to the newer version, the 14.2, the 14.3 versions of Clarity, there is as Steve mentioned, Jaspersoft is a new reporting tool that's coming to picture. And it does not mean that the business objects is going away. The business objects is still staying. So that means there's an added infrastructure hardware that needs to be provisioned to accommodate the new reporting tool that's coming to the picture. The good thing about this is they have a parallel run of both the business objects and the Jaspersoft reporting while provisioning for a new server for Jaspersoft. And they don't need to turn it all on get-go with the Jaspersoft reporting. After the upgrade, they can continue let the users use the business objects and then slowly turn back on just Jaspersoft, making sure that it fulfills their need of the reporting piece. And Steve also mentioned other considerations for it applies for everybody is the features that are coming into picture, because certain features may be useful, may not be useful. So financial features, especially that came in the 13s, that may need to be turned off, and that I would let John take over from me to talk more about those features that I just mentioned, and he can also talk about the on-demand.
Okay, thanks, Ramesh. A couple of things that probably go without saying for either on-premise or on-demand. Certainly, when you do an upgrade, you want to have a before image so you can do a side-by-side comparison of what it used to look like, what it looks like now, and make sure nothing broke, because there are some things that might change during the upgrade. And just like any other thing, you want to treat it like a UAT, so you can get people involved in certainly doing not only the PPM part, but the business process part. As far as specifically talking about on-demand, of course, CA does the heavy lifting. They do all the upgrade for you. And at the same time, if you're going to 14, they install the Jaspersoft components. However, be aware that they do not set up Jaspersoft in the data warehouse. So that's up to the client for an on-demand environment. And it's a process that usually happens after the upgrade. So that's something you'll have to plan for, and certainly something we can assist you with. As far as the feature function, if you're coming from a pre-13 environment, I guess there are people out there still on 12, and then certainly you know that the financials are rewritten. So if you're going to go from 12 to 14, then you got financials to consider. If with 13.1, the cost type came in, and then 13.2, portfolio manager was completely rewritten. So if you're coming from a 13.1, then you also have some other considerations for planning. How are you going to implement the cost type, which generally replaces charge code within the projects and within portfolios. So some planning. Some things you have to do immediately. Some things you might just plan for to implement over time. Some things you might run parallel until you can get projects or reports and portals shifted over. So those are some of the key items to consider as you're going from a lower environment to a 14.2 or 14.3 environment.
Great, thanks. So we have a question that's come in. Brian, maybe we can direct this one to you. In terms of Jaspersoft and business objects, are any of those two features, programs impacted by doing an upgrade?
So no, you're not going to have an impact. You can still use business objects. You can still use your crystal reporting. So Jaspersoft is now available, and at some point they're going to phase out business objects and crystal reporting, so you're going to want to get on a path to get that set up so that you can convert everything to Jaspersoft. Either the ad hoc, which is more of your BO, or the for the crystal reporting, the studio on Jaspersoft. So you don't have to switch to Jaspersoft by going to the 14.
Okay.
You are, which is what we recommend for most of our clients. Is to do like a technical upgrade, go from 13 to 14.3, and then get in the Jaspersoft, have your team look at it, evaluate it, and then have a different project to do the complete conversion and the rollout, because there's training involved, there's converting the existing reports, and you don't want to keep people living in both environments. You more or less want to convert everything at once and move everyone over.
No, great. Thank you for answering that question for us. So you talked about, the technical side, so let me throw this out to the group. Certainly there are probably functional issues as well that come into play, and downstream functional ramifications that need to be understood. Steve, let's go back to you on that. What are some of the things downstream that people should be considering when they're looking at an upgrade from a functional point of view?
So from a functional perspective, so first of all, as you look through the upgrade, different upgrade levels have different capability, different different content. If you're going to 14, the first step that I would say functionally is take a look at your reports, like Brian was talking about, right? And take a look at what reports you need and how do you use them. If you're going to eventually be converting over your reports, rather than just blindly copying over your reports individually, really try to think through what reports it makes sense to convert. Okay, you may look at it and say, hey, we have scripts that we run, and we'll check to see how often is a report run. So one major client that I managed the instance for a number of years, we looked, and we had 60-some reports. There were several that hadn't been run in over a year. So step back, look at those reports, think about how they fit into your business process, and think, do I really need to convert them, right? You got that piece. If you're going from an earlier version of 13, like 13.1 or 13.2, then there's some really fun functional stuff to think about, okay? There's some financial changes, right, that are really cool, right? You've got some additional capabilities, but you need to think about how those fit. If you're currently financially enabled, how those fit in, right? And how you're going to test them, right? And then the last thing is there were some changes as we went from 13 to 14 in portfolios, right? Big changes in portfolios, some really cool new content released. How does that fit into your business processes? So again, step back and think about how this impacts your processes, what's your business going to think, and how are you going to test those and deploy those?
Great. Thanks. John, let's turn to you. And you had mentioned financials. Talk to us about some of the changes that have happened with financials. Is that only specific to if you're in a 13.x moving up to a 14.x, or are there changes to the financials in the 14s?
Most of the changes came with 13.1 and 2. With the advent of cost type, which replaces charge code throughout the system, and the rewrite of Portfolio Manager, which of course financials feeds directly. That's where most of those changes are. Some of them in 14, they also enhanced the Portfolio Manager to There used to be, I think, a 250 investment limit on portfolios for performance. They removed that. They modified the code, the queries, and now there's an unlimited number, although in 14 you still have a limit of 25 roles in portfolios. So that's mostly what's new.
Great, thank you. Ramesh, if you're working with a client on the pre-planning phase of an upgrade, what do you think would be the 2 or 3 most important things to consider during the pre-planning phase of an upgrade?
One of the most important things is to find out if the version of their database and the operating system is compliant with the version of the Clarity that they're planning to upgrade to, because there are still a lot of customers who are running, for example, on the SQL Server, the SQL Server 2008, which is no longer supported in the 14.3, so they would need to upgrade their database and I know to plan it appropriately, because we don't want the upgrades to kind of go head-to-head with each other, so it needs to be properly planned, the infrastructure upgrade versus the Clarity upgrade. So they need to go hand in hand so that the whole process goes successfully and smoothly.
Let me add something there on the on-demand as well. As you know, in on-demand, CA automatically installs PMO Accelerator. And, you know, it comes with a lot. It comes with reports, portlets. It comes with rights groups. There are about 20 some odd rights groups that are PMO. And so as part of that install, it installs those rights groups in an active mode. Many clients deactivate some or all of those PMO rights groups. So just be aware they'll be reactivated. It's just a simple matter of making sure you know what you're set before the upgrade and just setting it back and deactivating the ones you don't need.
Oh, super. Nice point.
Well, one of the common items that we're seeing with 14 is, as Ramesh was saying, if you're on premise and you're moving from, you know, maybe you're using Oracle 11.2 or an older version of SQL Server, okay, it's important as you plan your upgrade to consider supportability. What we've seen some clients do is they move ahead and they try to update the database first to jump the database to the newest version. What they get in a quandary with is they're now upgrading a version of Clarity using a database or an operating system that's not supported. And what we always try to do is lay out the upgrade so that you maintain on a supported version. So in the event that you hit an issue that we have to call on CA support, your environment, your hardware stack, and your software stack is supported. Otherwise, you can get in a position where support really can't help you out. So it's just something to give some consideration to. It can be a little tricky. If you haven't done it before, it's pretty routine for us.
That's great.
Yeah, just to add to Steve, it's happened a couple of times to me where the cart was put before the horse, where the database got upgraded, which was not supported by the version of Clarity that was running. So it was sort of, we had to go backtrack and then get the database backwards before we could do the upgrade to the right version of Clarity and then upgrade the database.
Oh, interesting. Brian, is there anything you'd add to things to consider in the pre-planning phase?
So again, you have to treat it like a major project, which it is, and just make sure you look at all the release notes, all the technical requirements, go through your documents accordingly, and then figure out which paths, how many phases you need to do. Upgrade the Clarity on a test server, then upgrade the database, or whatever order you need to do it in. If you're on demand and you're not at their current data center out in California, they'll ask you to move there first before you do your next upgrade. So that's a separate initiative that can be done, and then you can plan your upgrade. But you don't have to take into account any of the technical aspects of it from the CA world, but only your own.
That's great. Thank you. So another question has come in, and I'll just throw this out to the group. The question is what impact will an upgrade have on things like jobs and scheduled processes?
Well, one of the major impacts we have seen in 14.2 is all the scheduled jobs and anything that's based on a process tend to be put on a canceled state. We have some workarounds for that, but that's one of the first results of an upgrade. The scheduled jobs that are based on a process tend to go into canceled mode. But CA has mentioned that they have fixed it in a later patch. I have not yet seen the fix myself, so I can't speak for the fix. But that is one of the things to be considered. So keep track of all the scheduled jobs before you do the upgrade, so that or have a comparison environment where you can compare and reschedule the same jobs.
The same, I think, the same holds true for scheduled reports.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Is there any advantage or disadvantage to, when you're doing your upgrade, to having a development environment and then moving to a production environment? How do you approach that?
The process. So first of all, the process that we follow for on-premise, right, is a traditional ITIL process, and we try to do as much as possible the same type of process for on-demand. But on-premise, what we really want to do is you have a dev, a test, and a prod. And you can't always do that with on-demand. But the idea behind the development environment is we start out with the run book that we think we're going to run. And that development environment is our chance to kind of fine-tune that run book and educate the team. Because many times what we're doing with clients is we're doing an over-the-shoulder upgrade, where we're there, but they're doing a lot of the groundwork, right? So the development environment, it's a huge advantage because then you're testing out this run book. When you run test is your dress rehearsal. You want to use the run book and the team that you're going to use for production and test, if at all possible. Then finally, when you go to prod, right, you've now done this run book 3 times with this, twice before with the same team twice before, and that's a huge advantage. We rarely have problems when we follow that process. Okay, so that's big. On demand, we try to do a similar type of process, and I'll hand it over to John. But with on demand, we only have one development environment, so we can't do it quite as thoroughly. So John, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit. Most clients I've worked with upgrades, they've chosen to do a prod refresh into dev first, so now you can do a side by side, and also you know that you're upgrading something that looks just like prod. So going to the run book story, not with run books, but what you want to do certainly in upgrading dev is you want to make sure you identify everything that's going to break, everything that you got to fix, all of your remediation, so you have that documented. So once you go to a prod upgrade, it should be a piece of cake, and there should be no surprises. I mean, there could be, but usually if you do it in a dev or test environment first and then go to prod, it's just almost automatic.
Super. Hey, thank you for that insight. Now, Steve mentioned education. I guess one of the things we should probably spend a few moments talking about is training. So Ramesh, let's ask this question to you. What degree of training needs to occur or should be considered when an upgrade happens?
Usually from a technical perspective, the technical team that's going to maintain the system needs to be given at least a deep dive overview of how the new version is functioning, what are the various components that go to make up the new version of Clarity, that includes the Jaspersoft, the business objects, the Clarity itself, and how it needs to be maintained from the underlying infrastructure, how the jobs need to be scheduled, because there are certain things that are unique to 14.3 which were not there in the 13s. So those things need to be, or mind melds have to be done with the technical team, to put it mildly. And since we keep talking about Jaspersoft, that is a key piece where, as Brian mentioned, it could be a project in itself, because there is a fair bit of training that needs to be involved to bring Jaspersoft online. And definitely I can let Brian talk about the Jaspersoft training. So Brian, why don't you jump in and talk about that?
So sure. So from a training perspective, when you're upgrading, if you're going to an upgrade where you're not using portfolio or you don't have financial changes from the end of 13 into 14, it should be somewhat transparent to the end user. So you just have to send out minor release notes of maybe a location change or some navigation enhancement that they've done. And then you should then launch into how you're going to deploy Jaspersoft. And if you're going to deploy Jaspersoft, you're just going to use it pretty much like Crystal, where you have standalone reports that people can run and schedule, or you'll run and schedule them for them. So training can be quite significant. The core team, what we've basically done is train them on how the Jaspersoft works within the tool once it's been upgraded. And then that core team decides how they're going to deploy it and what kind of training schedules they're going to use and methods.
Great, thank you. So what are some of the things that the four of you have seen that have been overlooked that caused a messy upgrade? Are there things that are lessons learned that smoother upgrade?
Unfortunately, every customer environment is unique, so lessons learned in one environment does not apply to another customer. But lessons learned in the dev environment significantly play a role. As Steve mentioned, the dev is really the piece where we're building the run book, and that lessons learned in dev, because there are customizations that tend to break the upgrade, or customizations tend to get broken during the upgrade. So both things have happened, and those lessons learned usually play a big role in the prod upgrade in that particular customer. But there's no real lessons learned that we can apply between customers, because each environment is significantly unique. John, how is that with on-demand?
Well, in on-demand, as I said, CA does the heavy lifting, so they're going to guarantee that the infrastructure is set properly. Yeah, on rare occasions, we've had issues where we had to kind of go back and revisit the install with a couple of things, Java-related things, but they usually go pretty flawlessly, and all you have to worry about is do your validations, remediations, and set up Jaspersoft. And I'll put another plug in there. Everybody's excited to get to see Jaspersoft in the data warehouse, and usually they just give that to administrators, let them get in there and play around. Certainly there are opportunities to add custom objects, custom attributes to the data warehouse, but my recommendation, as Brian said, get in there and figure it out, see what you got, and then once you get ready to roll it out, then set up a project to do that and to do it right.
I would the items that I would think about for both on-demand and on-premise. Okay. First of all, look outside of Clarity. The Clarity piece usually, if you're working with Rego, the Clarity piece, normally we've got people on it that have done this many times before. We can lead you through it. Working it a little messy is if you're a larger company, right? Your PCs are locked down, and now you're moving to a version of Clarity that may not be compatible with your version of IE or your browser. So step back and think through, look at the release notes. What version of MSP do you need? What version of MSP is your company going to be on? Okay. What version of browser? And try to think about these types of items, because that can be really messy. If you do the upgrade, maybe your test group has the newest browser because these are the power users, and you find out you've got a work team that's trying to log into Clarity and they can't even submit timesheets because their browser's too old. Right? So think about that. Think about MSP. Specifically related to on-premise, what I would say is I personally, and we are passionate, that whenever you do an upgrade, we insist that you look at your sizing, your architecture, and kind of a brief look at your performance. We had customers as they moved to 13, before we were involved, actually bought the wrong hardware stack. Okay, bought the wrong database server, right, and then had to move it back. So we insist that we do a quick sizing if you're on premise, and that's just a lesson learned for us. So and it's pretty cheap for us to do a sizing. It's a matter of hours. It's not a matter of days.
Yeah, the other patch that I would be concerned about is while you have Jaspersoft and you can use it right away, what I've done at many of the clients is we're not toting that Jaspersoft is the reason we're doing the upgrade. We're just doing an upgrade in order to get it technically up to the next release. And then we deploy Jaspersoft as a second initiative where we control it, as opposed to I've seen where some clients are saying, okay, we're doing this and Jaspersoft is coming, and then their user community is breathing down their neck to get it out as quickly as possible, and they start driving the deployment as opposed to the team driving how it should be deployed and when it can be deployed. I'm not saying that you want to lag it, but you want to first understand it so you can move it out successfully with your organization.
Let me throw something else out that I've seen in virtually every upgrade. This probably is applied to on-premise as well as on-demand. And everyone, even if you have the right supported browser version and whatever it is, there's always going to be that user, and it's not everybody, that user that when they log into Clarity the first time after the upgrade, they see trash. They don't see the menu list. They don't see, they can't get anywhere. All right, and that's going to happen to some people. And the first thing you need to be thinking about is clear out cache in the browser. Okay, I mean, it seems simple, but sometimes people don't think about that, and that's usually the solution. And after that, everything's everything's wonderful. But just remember that, make a note of that. Clearing out cache will solve a lot of things that happen when you first get into a new version.
And I have to agree with John because it happens to the 1 or 2 users, and sometimes the 1 or 2 users are the high-level power users who can raise a lot of noise because they're not able to get it.
Or the big boss, right?
Yes.
So speaking of that, with power users and the big boss and stuff, who are the groups of stakeholders that should be involved during the decision process to do an upgrade?
Well, I think we should get the finance approval because they are going to put the budget for the upgrade. So that is always the first group. And probably the people who have to test, because the QA testing group has to be involved through. And I have customers where the QA group is the moving force behind an upgrade rather than the users or the finance team, because they want to be on a more compliant version of Clarity.
And you want a slice of the organization. So everybody, like I said, in any upgrade, you need to check the business processes and make sure everything still works. Especially if you got interfaces, you want to make sure they still work. So a slice of the organization that's going to be impacted, certainly.
Super. What about an architecture stack review? Can one of you talk about an architecture stack review and the value that comes from doing that?
Sure, I can talk about it. Steve started off on doing that review earlier when he spoke about some of the salient features of an upgrade. So for this mainly applies to on-premise customers more than the on-demand. So we would have to send out a questionnaire, get them to answer the questionnaire, find out what their current environment is. Then based on that, based on the number of users, concurrency, and so on and so forth, come up with a recommendation of what the new infrastructure should look like for the 14.3 or the 14.2 versions of Clarity they would be going, with keeping in mind the number of users, the usage, the functionality. One other thing that we would have to keep track of is the Jaspersoft has a slightly different Tomcat versions, what is known as the Tomcat Abyss that we have encountered a few times. I let Steve talk about the Tomcat Abyss, but so he can take up from what I left off on the architecture.
Yeah, and we jokingly call it the Tomcat Abyss in-house, but all it is you've just got to be careful. Some clients use their own versions of Tomcat, and you've just got to watch to make sure that and also depending on your architecture stack, you may find yourself with a different Tomcat for Jaspersoft versus a different Tomcat for Clarity. They're both on the same server. You've just got to coordinate that, and that's something that if you're doing your first upgrade, it's kind of tricky. If you've done this multiple times, you can work your way through it without too much of a problem. So.
And that also applies to the Java JDK, because if you're going from a 13 or below 13 to the 14.3, it actually requires multiple versions of Java JDK through the upgrade, which it performs automatically. So you need to have all of them ready, available, and give the various paths as it is doing the upgrade. So that's another tricky portion, especially if you're going from a 13 or below to the 14.3.
Thanks. Well, I think we don't have any more questions that have come in, and it looks like we're down to about the end of our questions. So to wrap up, I'd just like to go around. We'll start with Brian, and just ask if each of you would give a concluding thought on either a best practice or a most important thing to consider in the process of looking at an upgrade. So Brian, we'll turn a few moments over to you.
Sure. So I'm more from the project perspective, so I would definitely make sure you get everybody involved up front and at least have, like they said, the QA team, which a lot of times drive things, is get all your testers set up, all of your stakeholders in place so that everyone's aware of what's happening. And then I would also make sure you plan it out so that you're releasing the components that you need to be released at when they should be released, so that you have appropriate training and exposure to the areas before just pushing it out to the rest of the community.
I will add to
John.
that. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'll just jump in real quick. Just to make sure you review the release notes. That probably goes without saying, because there are some subtle changes that we haven't even talked about. that you'll encounter, and some of them are additional features and functions. Just review them. Also, you'll see in there the bugs and bug fixes, those kinds of things that have come from CA, so you're aware of what you're going to encounter. Oh, 14.3 is a pretty clean environment.
And to add to that, I would add always do an architecture review and a sizing review, because the 14.3 requires different resources than the previous versions of Clarity. So that is one key thing to do, is an architecture review and sizing. Because you could have a clean environment all upgraded, but then the moment the 10th user comes in, it kind of slows to a crawl. That is because the back end is not sufficiently provisioned.
Thank you.
I would probably wind up by saying test. Test, try to do a thorough functional test. Also consider that if you're using MSP, make sure that somebody's testing MSP, and really take the time to test up front as early as possible, so that you can push, if there are any issues, you can, go back to CA support and get those issues resolved before you're down to the wire. Testing is critical.
Great. Well, Brian, John, Ramesh, and Steve, thank you for your time and your insights. I've learned quite a bit today. So as we wrap up, we'd just like to remind our viewers of 2 upcoming events. On January 28th, we will have our next regoUniversity webinar, which will be around workflows. And also, we'd like to remind you that regoUniversity registration is open. regoUniversity will be April 25th through the 28th in Tempe, Arizona. And our early bird registration will end on February 15th. So if you are planning on attending and want to get the lower price for the registration, make sure you visit regoUniversity.com to register before February 15th. With that, thank you very much, and we hope all of you have a wonderful day.
Happy upgrade.
Thanks a lot. Take care.